You threw away your fiancée because you thought she was a cleaner. The words hit Eric like a slap. He stood frozen as hundreds of guests turned to look at him. On the stage, the woman he had humiliated just days earlier sat beside government officials and business leaders. Today, we celebrate the owner of Royal Crown Hotel, Miss Amara Akhafer. The room erupted into applause. Eric's knees nearly buckled. Owner? No, that couldn't be possible. Because the last time he saw Amara, she was pushing a cleaning cart and scrubbing floors. And because of that, he had ended their engagement. But we need to go back. Because to understand how Eric found himself standing in the middle of a gala with 300 pairs of eyes cutting through him like glass, you need to understand who these two people were before wealth rewrote everything Eric thought he believed. Eric Adebio had always known he would be somebody. Born in Lagos to a middle-class family with more ambition than money, Eric grew up watching his father work 2 jobs without complaint, pressing his shirts the night before work as though dignity lived in the details. That image never left him. Neither did the hunger. He left Nigeria at 27 with a business plan, a single suitcase, and 40,000 naira borrowed from his mother. 6 years later, he had turned a modest logistics startup into a company valued at over $200 million. He had offices in London, Dubai, and Toronto. He had cars he hadn't driven and a penthouse he rarely slept in. But throughout all of it, there was Amara. They had met at a cousin's wedding 3 years before he left. She had been standing near the drink table arguing passionately with someone about the mismanagement of Nigerian infrastructure, completely unbothered that she was the most beautiful person at the event. Eric had introduced himself 3 times before she remembered his name. He found that extraordinary. They built something slow and careful across the distance. Video calls at odd hours. Voice notes that stretched past midnight. The kind of relationship that grows stronger because it has to survive inconvenience. When he finally boarded his flight home, the ring was already in his jacket pocket. He had been carrying it for 4 months, waiting for this exact moment. He told his mother. He told his best friend. He told anyone who would listen. He could not wait to see her. What he did not expect was his cousin Victor to be at the airport. Victor Adebio was the kind of man who measured everything in appearances. He drove the newest car not because he loved cars, but because he needed people to see him inside one. He dressed not for himself but for the room. And he had strong opinions about the kind of woman a man of Eric's standing should be returning home to. On the drive from the airport, between loud declarations about how well Eric looked and how proud the family was, Victor said it quietly but deliberately. You know your status has changed. The woman you left behind, she's not quite where you are anymore. Eric brushed it off. He didn't want to hear it, but the seed had been planted. 2 days after landing, Eric drove to the Royal Crown Hotel in Victoria Island, where Amara worked. She had texted him earlier that week to say she was at the hotel and he could come by to surprise her. He imagined finding her in a corner office, maybe managing events. She had always been sharp, organized, the kind of person who could walk into any room and quietly take it over. He stepped through the revolving doors of the Royal Crown into a lobby that smelled of fresh flowers and cool marble. Staff moved with practiced efficiency. Everything about the place whispered money, and then he saw her. She was in a gray uniform pushing a cleaning cart between 2 decorative pillars. Her hair was tucked under a cap. She was leaning forward, wiping down a surface near the front desk, her back to the entrance. Eric stopped walking. For a moment he thought he had the wrong person. He blinked. Looked again. It was Amara. She turned around and her face broke into the kind of smile that had survived 3 years of distance and time zones. She said his name. She moved toward him, but something had already shifted behind his eyes. He hugged her. He smiled. He said the right words, but the ring stayed in his pocket. That night he called Victor. He didn't mean to. He told himself he just needed to think out loud. But Victor had a way of confirming whatever doubt you brought to him, layering it with new evidence until it felt like wisdom. She's cleaning floors, Eric. You're running a $200 million company. What does that conversation look like in 5 years? Eric said nothing. Victor said, I'm not telling you who to love. I'm telling you to think clearly. Eric told himself he was thinking clearly. Over the following days, he became distant. He canceled dinner twice. He replied to her messages hours late. When they did meet, he was present in body only, his mind pulling away from her in slow, deliberate degrees. Amara noticed. She was not a woman who ignored things she could see clearly. She asked him directly one evening while they sat in his car outside her apartment building, the city moving around them like it didn't know their world was quietly coming apart. What's wrong? She asked. And I mean really wrong. He looked at the dashboard. Nothing, he said, just tired. She watched him for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly and said good night. But her eyes said she didn't believe him. The confrontation came on a Thursday. They were at his family home, sitting in the living room while the evening moved through the open windows. Victor was there too, which turned out to matter more than Eric understood at the time. Victor said something careless about how Eric had come home to build an empire and needed people around him who understood that world. He didn't use Amara's name. He didn't have to. Amara set down her cup. She looked at Victor with the kind of calm that takes real strength to maintain, and she said, I think you should let Eric speak for himself. Victor smiled and said nothing more. Eric felt the room waiting. He said it carefully, as though careful words could make an unkind thing kind. He said that the world he was building now required a certain kind of visibility, that the people he worked with, the partners, the investors, they paid attention to these things. He said he needed someone who could stand beside him in certain rooms. The silence that followed was heavy enough to sit on. Amara stood up slowly. She looked at him the way you look at something you are memorizing because you will not see it again. She said, do you believe that who I am is determined by what I wear to work? Eric opened his mouth, closed it. She said, the man I fell in love with used to say that character was the only currency that mattered. I wonder where he left that. She reached into her bag and placed her engagement ring on the coffee table between them, not with anger, with something quieter than that. With finality. She said, if you ever find him again, tell him I hope he's well, and she left. Eric sat in the silence she had made and told himself he had done the right thing. Victor said nothing. For once. 3 days later, Eric received an invitation through a business associate. A gala celebrating the 10-year anniversary of one of Lagos's most prestigious luxury hotels. A property that had recently been ranked among the top 5 hotels in West Africa. The invitation came with a note that said significant investment opportunities would be presented on the evening. He almost didn't go. He went because it was business. because it was exactly the kind of room Victor had told him he needed to be seen in. He arrived at the Royal Crown Hotel in a dark suit and found the lobby transformed. Soft gold lighting, tall arrangements of white flowers, guests moving in expensive fabric with the careful ease of people accustomed to rooms like this. He was halfway to the bar when he noticed something. The staff that passed him moved with a particular alertness. There was a quiet electricity in the room that he couldn't place at first. He took his seat as the program began. A general manager stepped to the podium and began speaking about the hotel's history, about the woman who had founded it, about her niece, who had inherited the property 7 years ago at the age of 22 and had refused to manage it from a distance. Eric heard the words, but they hadn't landed yet. The manager said she had worked in every department of the hotel. Not as an exercise in public relations, not for a story to tell at galas, but because she believed that you could not lead people well if you did not understand what they carried. She had worked as a receptionist, as a kitchen assistant, as a housekeeper, as a cleaner. Eric felt the air change. The manager said, "Please welcome the owner of the Royal Crown Hotel." The room rose. Amara walked onto the stage. She wore deep green that caught the light. Her shoulders were back. Her eyes were clear. She looked like someone who had never doubted who she was, not for a single day. The applause lasted a long time. Eric did not clap. He could not move. He found her afterward in a side corridor near the exit, speaking quietly to a member of staff. He waited until she was done. When she turned and saw him, her expression did not change. He said her name, just that. One word and everything he had broken loaded into it. She looked at him and said, "Hello, Eric." He said, "I didn't know." She said, "I know you didn't." He said, "That's not an excuse." She said nothing, which was worse. He said, "I had become so consumed with how things looked that I stopped seeing what they were. I looked at you in that uniform and I let someone else's voice drown out everything I knew about you, everything I knew about myself. And I am sorry, not because of what you own, but because I was willing to throw away the best thing in my life over something that had nothing to do with love." The corridor was quiet. Somewhere behind them the gala carried on. Amara looked at him for a long time. She said, "My aunt used to say that wealth reveals character, not builds it, reveals it. She said you find out what a person is made of when comfort arrives, because comfort is the real test." She paused. She said, "You failed it, Eric." He said, "Yes." She said, "And you know you failed it." He said, "Yes." She looked down at her hands, then back at him. She said, "The man I loved was still in that room when you left. I could see him trying to say something. He just couldn't find the words." She reached into her clutch. She placed the engagement ring on his palm and closed his fingers around it. She said, "Don't come back until you've decided which version of yourself you're going to be. Not for me. For you." She walked back toward the light. 4 months later, Eric sold his stake in 3 investment vehicles he had acquired purely for appearances. He let Victor go from the advisory board. He had a long, uncomfortable conversation with himself about what the last 6 years had quietly done to the way he saw the world. He reached out to Amara. She did not respond immediately. She took her time. Because she was not a woman who rewarded grand gestures with easy forgiveness. She was a woman who watched what people did after they said who they were. When she finally agreed to meet him, they sat in a quiet restaurant near the waterfront. No audience, no occasion, just two people trying to find the thread they had dropped. It was not easy. Nothing real ever is. But the thread was still there. 6 months after that evening, Eric and Amara launched a foundation together. The Amara Akhafer Foundation for Hospitality Workers provided educational grants, business training, and mentorship for hotel staff, cleaners, kitchen workers, and service industry employees across Lagos and Abuja. At the launch event, a journalist asked Amara what had inspired the foundation's focus. She said, "I once watched a man I loved reduce another human being to the uniform they were wearing. And I realized that if someone who claimed to know and love me could do that so easily, then the problem was much larger than one man. It was a lesson worth turning into something useful." The journalist asked if she had forgiven him. She looked at Eric, who was standing a few feet away, watching her with the particular attention of a man who had learned, slowly and painfully, to actually see. She said, "Forgiveness isn't the interesting part. Growth is." The last thing the narrator says before the screen goes dark. Sometimes the most powerful people in the room are the ones you walked past without looking up. And sometimes the greatest loss is not a failed investment or a broken deal. It is the moment you let someone else's voice become louder than your own knowing. Eric almost lost everything that mattered because he confused standing in the right rooms with being the right man. He found his way back, but only after Amara showed him that the uniform had never been the story. She had always been the story. He had simply forgotten how to read.